everybody to the Tridion Docs 14 SP4 Bootcamp. And the bootcamp will be presented by Marina, myself, and Ben. This session will be recorded, so just be aware of it. The agenda for today for the bootcamp is we talk about the platform support, a little bit about the web client, the rebranding, of course, the collective spaces. So in the middle of the collective spaces presentation, we have a coffee break, or tea break, and then we will continue with the collective spaces. And then the client tools, something about the vulnerabilities, and the is deploy and is remote, and other coffee break or tea break. And the bootcamp will end with the session on the DXD. So if you have any questions, you can actually write them in the chat, or wait for the coffee tea breaks. And after the coffee tea break, we have some time allocated for some questions and answers. The Content Manager platform support. So for the platform support, all the old versions like the 9.2 till the 13th version, they are retired. So we don't give any support for them anymore. So the last one actually was the Docs 13. They were actually ended on July this year. So only the full version, the 14 version is fully supported, including all the service packs. The platform and integrations. So we introduced on the 14 SP4 the document history for review space and our semantic AI offering. Then we go to the deprecation list. They can actually see that we added the data open toolkit reference for the output format for Is HTML help. And I will come back to that on why that is. And also we're going to deprecate the pull translations, and we're more focusing for the future for the push translations with translation jobs. And the obsolete is basically the same as the one in 14 SP3. So what's in the box of this presentation? So we only highlight the main difference compared to the 14 SP3 release. And of course, you already know that we don't supply anymore the content editor, the quality assistant, the legacy content delivery, and also the Tridion Docs collaborative review is no longer part of our offering and not included in the box. For Windows Server, so we still support Windows Server 2019, the core or desktop edition, but not the nano one, so that still remains the same. And we also still support Windows 2016. Windows or Microsoft just released the Windows 2022, but we didn't have any time yet to validate that everything is working. So it will, at the moment, will be not supported, but it might change over time, maybe next year. That it's going to be supported, but currently we're not supporting Windows 2022. Then we come to the Java section. So we're going to support Java 17, so the Adoptium or the Oracle one. Doesn't really matter. And also we still support OpenJDK 11 and also Oracle 11. So in Java 17, they actually removed the Nashorn JavaScript engine, and that engine actually is used in the Is HTML help that we supply as a reference. So that one is no longer working in Java 17, but still it works in Java 11. So if you want to use it, it's still supported in Java 11. If you're using Java 17, the Is HTML help is no longer working. And the same applies as well if you have written your own data open toolkit, rendering of output format, and you're using a JavaScript engine, please check it first with Java 17 if it's still working. That's a small remark and warning if you're upgrading to Java 17. From the browsers, so we still support Microsoft Edge, the Chromium one, the Chrome, and the Firefox. And not supported is the Microsoft Edge Spartan. I think it was the support ended something like in the middle of March or April. So in 14th SP3 it was supported for a couple of months, but it's now fully not supported anymore in the 14 SP4. And the same applies for the Microsoft Internet Explorer 10 and 11. The configuration for the quick start settings, there are not that many changes, so everything still remains compatible. We made some changes to the XML write object plugin configuration. So the plugin for the is annotation raises the set resolve on field and set resolve by field events. We changed the plugin for the is sys condition to metadata plugin for the conref. So the condition extraction on XML element with XML conditions and varref attributes is working now. And for the write plugin, actually we reordered some of the plugins for the write. And for collective spaces, the configuration we added basically support for batches in out and view to add some configuration, but the default out of the box is still compatible. Something about indeed the write plugin ordering stuff. So we actually do the is extract title to metadata. So we store the title in the metadata field. And we did that before we running actually other plugins that might infect the title. So maybe for an uppercase, maybe we do that later. But we actually change order. So you now do all the plugins that are actually modifying the title or can modify the title. And as last step, we're trying to extract the title. For the web client, we add a request that sometimes the yellow is not really readable. So on the left, you can see it is hard to read, but yeah, yellow is still not that nice color, but we try to improve it a little bit and make the wording of the condition a little bit darker and in the rest of the yellow a little bit brighter. So hopefully it's more readable, so it improves a little bit of the contrast. So hopefully it will work, and people can see more on the condition now with this small change. There is a change in the behavior of the type tag-less control. So we still have the support both configuration settings. So you have the auto suggest. That's mainly for the PIM use case if you're large flat list or a taxonomy, and it's hard to load into a structure view. You can actually query for it, and it will actually only return results based on what you typed in. And we still also support the structure view, but if you specify both of them, the auto suggest will win. So if you want to have the structure view, you should actually remove the auto suggest. And that is also why we suggest, or we advise actually use the structure view so it's easy to navigate. And also suggest maybe you have to type in and be lucky and find it. But but that's still a good use case if you have a very huge list where people have to choose from. So when we actually did this change, then we also detecting, hey, in a web client, we also have the type tag-less control. And that was not really working if you configure one of them, also only the auto suggest or only the structure view. Then it was some kind of a misbehavior in the display of that control. So we also fixed that one in the web client. When we actually still were working on a bit of the semantic AI, we also noticed on the we actually do the multi-fields, multi-value fields, and for the single field, we also try to improve it as well a little bit on draft space in a web client. We're using the field definition to understand if it's a single or a multi-field, and then based on that one, then people can only select a single tag in that particular field. So a small improvement. And now I want to hand over to Marina, who will continue the presentation.
So the spell check. You need to enable it. So takes time a little bit. And unknown elements will be highlighted, basically, the text. Basically, that's it. Besides running your deploy commands and so on to enable it for the spell checker. And for review spaces, basically, we have expanding tables in the review space. So it is possible to expand it or to have a compressed. This is a compressed view. Is it there? Yeah. So for numbers, it's applicable. For maybe with more richer content, maybe it's more suitable to use expand tables option. Then let's see how to hazard statements would be rendered in the draft space and danger nodes. So basically, this is how it's rendered in the draft space. And how it's rendered in review space as well. Then regarding the outline for conditions being rendered in review space, so you can see an example. This is a false condition, so it won't be rendered in the review space, and those components will be rendered in the review space. Filtering conditions in the review space. We find the example how we render conditions in the draft space. And name. This is how it's rendered in the review space. Okay. Let's go further. The improvements together for the draft and review spaces. So with this before, how the content was appearing in the draft and review space. So it's a better background right now, and the content is more readable. So you can see the difference between before and after. This is how the footnotes are rendered in the draft and review space. So this is the before example, and this is the screenshot how it's work right now. We added languages for both draft and review spaces. So Spanish, French, and Italian were added in both collected in draft and review spaces. Rendering, not resolving. So basically, the font that doesn't do anything for rendering a key ref and key. So we actually had a solution to how to resolve it. Basically, I think it will be maybe better if I show you during demo. But for instance, not resolving the key ref, still professional services can potentially show a custom sidebar for that. This is the example of rendering key ref in the draw space. So this is like all over on the top of the element, and we put key ref into the curve placed so it's visible for the user. This is the behavior configuration for the sidebar. So it's possible to actually stop sidebar in drafting and review spaces. And it's applicable with the help of the each condition. Ivo will be demoing it a bit later. How we are rendering related links in draft and review spaces. So you can see from the example how it's in the draft space. And this is the improvements for the review space rendering. Auto resolve title for each ref attributes for the links. So basically, topic with only topics of the scope of the publication. This is what resolves for each ref. Topic with only with the hashtag topic with only with the within this topic, and topic with hashtag the same topic with only with the topic in the scope of the publication. And one note is nav title is used for not loaded documents, and documents title is used for loaded document. So this link text not resolved for xref values in the format. There's the examples. How can ref and the vref are rendered in both draft and review space? So for those attributes for ref and vref, we can only configure elements. So this is the example of the on the slides, and the recommendation is avoid to have a mixed content for conref and vref rendering. And some changes for the xref rendering behavior-wise. So before xref was without text rendering, the placeholder, and what was fixed, xref without text rendering with the xref attribute value as a text. So you can see the examples here, especially of the link. So without text, it will be like that. With the text, it will be rendered this way. Little bit about keyref attributes for xref. So there is no support for keyref resolving for the collected spaces. So xref with the keyref attribute and without text will be rendered with the message that resolving of the keyref is not supported, as you see in the screenshot. xref with the keyref attributes and with text will be rendered with the text from the xref right here. And keyref attributes has higher priority than xref attributes. So in case xref with the keyref attributes and with the href attribute and without text will be rendered with the message that resolving of the keyref is not supported. And xref with the keyref attributes and with the href attributes and with text will be rendered as text from the xref. Conditions in the outline for both draft and review spaces. So conditions on the topic ref or specialized topic ref in the map will now also be shown in the outline view. And for the children of the topic ref, the condition with the values false, that will also show false. In cases then there is no condition on the child topic ref, or the condition on the child topic ref evaluates to true. This is how actually in the outline true and false condition will be rendered. And I will show you how to move component with the conditions right, and how it will be actually becoming false or not false. a little bit about pages in the outline. So pages in the outline helps reviewers to navigate, not only reviewers, but authors and the one who are actually editing documents and reviewing in the draft and review space, because pages are applicable for both draft and review spaces. So it is possible to set up different badges status from the list that we have already configured. And what is important, and in terms of usability, it's possible to set filters on the badge status. So for the user convenience, it will be easier actually to create the content or review the content or something like that. Document history. Document history is introduced as functionality for both draft and review spaces, and it requires licenses. That means it should be purchased for both separately. Sorry, it should be purchased if a client is willing to have document history for the draft space. So it's a separate license for the draft space and for the review space. It's possible to have access to the document history in the outline, as in draft space it was here, and I'm going to show it later. But we also introduced from the UI perspective the show changes button in the draft space, and the same thing we introduced for the review space for the user convenience. And it's also possible to open it with the hotkey combination, as here, Ctrl-Shift-Y. So this is the cases when in the UI, when document history will be hidden or disabled. So basically, or in case that the customer has no license for both draft and review spaces, for instance, or any of it that the user is trying to use and don't have a license. Components are low. Components is not loaded due to the error. Sometimes components are, for instance, release, and it's not possible to see a document history. Then someone else checked out the component, and component cannot be updated in this stage of the workflow. And the last one, when a publication is released. So enable and disable document history is possible with the deploy commands, and Ivo is gonna demo it a bit later. Draft space custom sidebar. This is the settings we have, and it loads with the. I think Ivo should be also showing that one. I'm not mistaken. Demo is a bit later. And regarding the custom sidebar, so basically it provides the information about the component for the user. Little bit about collective spaces revision, the position recovery flow. I think it should be familiar to you. The changes is this is highlighted over here, basically the review position recovery that we have recall instead to document history and multiple document versions protected by auto context. And a little bit for the demo for draft and review spaces together. So this is draft space, and you can see it. We have localization for the languages, English, Spanish, and Italian for the draft space, and the review space. Same languages. Then let me show you how the related links are rendered in the draft space. Oh, sorry, in the review space now, because it was presented on the slide. Then conditions in the outline showing true and false conditions. So you can see how it will be, how it's rendered in the outline in review space. And if I want to, for example, see something. Right, the condition becomes false because the parent is false. This one, badges in the outline. So it is possible to set up badges for the draft and review space. I'm in a draft space right now. And this is, for instance, a badge was added. Today, and you can also filter it out what the topic is. It has that status. That's the one. It has the status, and it's filtered out in the outline by the status. Custom sidebars. It's possible to actually add custom sidebar. Multiple actually custom sidebars in draft and review space. Draft space. And I forgot to add it in the review space. I'm sorry. It should be custom sidebar over here as well. Okay. Then in the when it comes to the document history for both draft and review spaces. Over here. So this is for the draft space. You can see show changes over here. For the document history, and that would be loaded revisions. Same, and it's, as I mentioned, it's still possible to go to the document history from what component you actually would like to see. What is checked out? And you can see show changes from here as well as it was before, so we didn't change that one. Same is for review. Also in the review space, it's possible to see revisions and document history for the publication from the same UI edition improvement. Okay. Let me go back to the presentation. So for the client tools, what we support regarding the platform support. So we support Oxygen from the version 23, and for the text editor, it's I think we don't support it anymore, but I need to check. I'm sorry. What is done for the Oxygen bridge, authoring bridge for the editor 23.1? So as I mentioned, we are supporting version 23.0 and higher. We know minor versions is preferred. For the publication manager, we had numbers of SRQs to fix. Some of them, for instance, compare view doesn't work for the maps in Tridion Docs, and preview pane doesn't show conditions and so on. So the solution was to these issues were fixed in this SP4 release. And for the publication manager, baseline autocomplete is fixed. When baseline is autocomplete, goes into the infinite loop of if there's any xref which doesn't exist. And for the content importer, importing maps. So maps imported without explicitly specified version numbers always replace version 1, regardless of whether version latest exists or released. And which version used when updated an object or imported. So default, and this is the file path. And for the content importer file to update the latest version. Yeah, how to do that and to create a new version. And for the content importer, Is Dxd ref attributes, it's added support for Is Dxd 1.3 ref attributes to be converted into if condition. So, Ivo, would you like to take control?
Yes, I will take over. I think hopefully you can see my screen. So we talk about the vulnerabilities. Of course, when you're writing software, hopefully everything goes okay, but sometimes there are vulnerabilities discovered later and they hopefully should be fixed. So we actually had a goal using Vercode actually for our scanning the vulnerabilities in our code. And we want to improve our quality. And we set some kind of levels basically with Vercode and together with RWS. We have level 1 and level 2, and we're actually aiming high already for level 2. And if you achieve actually level 2, that level 2 policy, you actually achieve a badge from Vercode. It's basically the Vercode verified standard badge. So that was our goal for improving our quality. For the level 2 security is basically, here's like a subset of kind of rules that we have to apply to, so it should actually disallow the flaw severity, but also meet in the security standards for OWASP 2017, and also disallow the CVSS score basically. So we have to run basically those scans on our software for level 2. So there was thousands of issues were discovered. And it took some while, but in the end, we actually achieved all green lights on all the scans we did on our software that we wrote. So we divided up in several sections for the desktop clients, also for our partner code that we included. So they're also scanned as well. For our backend or desktop Java clients as well, and the front-end application. So it was quite an achievement, and like I said, thousands of issues that were discovered, and we actually fixed and mitigated them. So we achieved it, the Vercode verified standard badge. So we were proud of that one. And you can also go to the Vercode website and actually look at the verified directory. They can actually find the RWS, and then you can see that the Tridion Docs is actually the verified standard. Is deploy. Continue is deploy. So is deploy, we also released a new version to that 3. And like Marina was talking about, all kind of is commandlets, and they're actually part of this to the 3 release. And also this is deploy also rules can also be used in all the versions as well. But the new functionality, of course, the new commandlets won't work on those all the versions. And you can actually go to the PowerShell gallery in order to install it. It is released. It's already there. There's a summary of what was actually presented before, but to give it in a small section. So enabling the collected spaces, there's now an extra option for document history for review space. So it requires a separate license. So also that's why we also have the extra option there to enable it. The is deploy commandlet for the Fonto content quality. So the Fonto content quality we used indeed for spell checker. So we added a couple of commandlets for enabling, disabling it. and also getting some kind of the property for the service as well. And indeed, when you enable the draw space option in the enable is UI collected spaces, we also automatically will start the content quality service. So it's already available. Here's the is deploy the front-end content quality. I give a demo about it. So actually how to install a new language to it. So out of the box, we only do the EN US in the EN one. And if you want to have an extra language, you have to do it yourself. And it's also there for modifying some files, so you can actually ignore certain words or come up with replacements. And that is also gonna demo as well. And these is basically the files that are required if you're using the install another language. So you need a dictionary in an affix file. Those are required, and the rest is basically optional for the spelling ignore, prohibited, and replacement for the text. And for the outline resolving, you saw it already. So indeed, for the outline, there may be variables that need to be replaced and all that kind of other kind of or key refs could be replaced. And then we're using the nef titles for those ones. But the nef titles, are the allowed elements that actually it depends a little bit about which kind of data you're using, or maybe even customize it. There's a difference already in 1.2 and 1.3. So in order to help the customer, we also extended the functionality to set is-fonto schema experience that basically will parse all the schemas, catalogs, and catalog mapping files, and actually will check what are the allowed child elements basically of the net title, the nav title, and that will actually be stored in a web.config, and that is actually using later for validation and also displaying all the right information in the title. So if you run the command, then the web.config is modified and it gonna look something like this, depending on your customizations, maybe on how it is installed. We also have is remote. So in is remote, we also added a couple of new commandlets there as well. So we have the is field type definition. Was already there, but we added some kind of new functionality to it. So on the data type, we get now a new value that is, or can be new value. So if your field is using the metadata binding to retrieve some labels, then you can actually see it in the data type, and the data source will actually display which data source it is using in the configuration of the XML extensions. And then in the crush column, we added an extra letter for T for tagging, for smart tagging. So now it's called crushed, and they can actually see if the T is there, then you know it's used for smart tagging. We also added some new commandlets. So for add is background task commandlet, and this one you can basically automate, for example, smart tagging content. So you can actually go to a particular folder, get all the topics out of there recursively, and then actually call a background task for smart tagging. Then the correct fields will be updated with the labels concepts extracted from the topic itself. And also we have an option there to also start it after a certain date. So you can also do some kind of push translations as well in the weekend, for example. So you can schedule it. We also have self-searching in the repository. That's also is a new commandlet, and that opens basically the full text index of our system. So you can actually perform a very simple query, basically a text query, and then we also enhance it a little bit with the rich query as well. So if you know the is query syntax, you can also use that one as well to get a better search result. And also we supply, or there is an extra functionality that it only returns the count. So not all the items itself, so you only retrieve the count. So the result should be much faster. Now a small demo on it. So here, for example, we have our draw space, and in this one I can also enable my spell checker. Then when it's there, it will actually see that like STL is a word. And we already know that we also are in the middle of rebranding. So we also want to come up with a suggestion that people should replace that word STL with RWS, and RWS should also be a term as well. So let me see if I can fix that. So if you go to the default installation, so it's in your app, then go to utilities, and then in utilities you use content quality. In the configuration, and there you have the spelling. And we actually supply two of them, is the English one and English US. But basically you have to look for your the right language. So if you open your XML, they can see we're using the language of your document. And in this case, it's E and US. So I'm going to use that one. So I'm gonna do replace. So basically, STL should be RWS. Let me save it. And then we also have ignore, and with ignore we put in RWS, so it will be recognized correctly. So that's it. So there's the modification, and if you modify something, you have to call a command. Commandlet is set is fonto content quality. You run it, and it does some magic behind the scenes. And then if you just turn it off, then turn it on again. And then go to the next one. They can actually see like RWS, it should be, or STL should be RWS. And then RWS is just ignored, so it will don't complain anymore. So this is how we can actually make changes to the hunt spell, basically. But yeah, not all people write in English, so I will also try to do. I've written a little bit in German. Not everything is correct, but hopefully spell checker will help me. So if I now open this spell checker, then it says, hey, it is complete, because actually I don't have spell checker installed for the German language. It could not find it, so that's why it actually says it is complete. So I go to my configuration again. I can also first have to show that what kind of in German, then indeed the language is DE. So I actually have to create a folder with that particular name. That is in the language. Got a new folder, DE. Then I already downloaded some dictionaries from the German ones. They are sometimes open source, but if they're Huntspell dictionaries, that's fine. You can create your own one or find them indeed on the internet. They go to content quality, configuration, spelling, and here. But this is enough already, so it as a basis, but you can also indeed copy maybe the ignore, the prohibited, replace in spelling to this folder. So also the RWS one, that's also then applicable for that one. So if you can actually per language, you can make the changes with what to ignore and what to replace and what to and which one is correct or you can ignore. So I save this one basically, then I run that famous command again. And now if I just turn it on, then you see it is enabled, and then you can actually see that my German is not very good. So then you can replace it, and that's how you actually do it. Adding a new language for spell checker. As you can see, I now have like on my system a couple of no extension bar basically, or no customization yet for a sidebar. So how do I enable it, and how can I configure it indeed for draft space and review space? So if you go to our collective spaces, there's a custom and there's actually a behavior config. And the behavior config basically, as a default, out of the box, we supply something. It's not really this example, but we give you an example that actually works. So if somebody trying to create their own sidebar and it's not working, and they call customer support, and the customer support can maybe say, hey, enable this one and see if that one is working. If that one is working, you know, the flow is working, but then probably it won't, something wrong on their end. So this case, I gonna just indeed uncomment the code. So you can basically see this in custom sidebar. And you also allow an is condition as well. So you can specify if it's used for draw space or review space. The URL that I'm using is basically the same. But indeed, I changed the label a bit. For this is for draw space and this is for review space. And also maybe good to know, if you want to play a little bit with it, you can also see that it's with the URL, and there's some kind of should be like an HTML page that's actually over here. That is actually going to be used when the sidebar is executed. And if you want to fiddle around with it as a starting point, this may be also a starting point when you are actually developing your own implementation of the custom sidebar. So if I now actually refresh the browser, reload, hopefully it will work. And here you can actually see this is basically the custom sidebar. So the custom sidebar actually received all the document, basically the topic content and some metadata as well. And that is actually sent to the sidebar. It's only like sending. We don't retrieve updates from the sidebar in our application. So it's basically read only on this part. Then of course I did not have my review open, so press review for my German text. Then this is review space, and then you should also have the sidebar, custom sidebar review space. And for this, it is basically the same one, but you can indeed configure it differently. So this is about how to enable the custom sidebars. And then I still have something indeed for the field definition. So I showed it already yesterday, but in here you can actually see if you ask it with is remote for your fields setup, the definition, then you can actually see that for the metadata binding, you actually return this particular new value for the data type is metadata binding, and also the data source is actually the data source used in your XML configuration. And then you can see actually the cross the T from smart tagging. We also have a new command that is basically the search. So it's called search is document object meaning is session. And then a simple query, then indeed you can do something like maybe collective spaces. And then you can ask for the count, for example, and then you can see you have about 2,300 items having the word collective spaces. But of course, you don't have to return all of them. You can also do something like with the max count to return like 25, and then only those 25 basically are returned to you, and then you can do something nice in your application. Indeed for draws or for Is Remote. This is it basically for the short demo for Is Deploy and Is Remote. Ben will continue the presentation on from the bootcamp from Tridion Docs on DXD. Ben?
Hi Ivo, thanks very much. So I want to just talk today about Dynamics Experience Delivery and significantly the recent changes we've got in the most recent release that we've had. Hopefully a lot of you have heard a lot about what we've been building recently on the semantic AI part, so I'll touch on that briefly, but I think Ivo's sessions and today's sessions have covered a lot of the ground in this area as well. So first up, what is DXD? For those that aren't familiar, it's another delivery platform that you can use with Tridion Docs, and it's a microservice-based delivery platform. It's based on Java and Spring Boot, and it's the platform that we share between Tridion Sites and Tridion Docs. So typically it's always been there as a Tridion Sites delivery platform. It came in later for Tridion Docs, and it's sometimes used for customers that have both content management platforms and they want to share their data between the two. So you can publish both Sites and Docs into a single DXD platform. So it's supported typically for Docs customers on sort of Windows and UX in terms of running the service. They are just Java based, so they run anywhere. Typically used either with SQL Server or Oracle. We also have an Elasticsearch cluster sitting underneath to support the services, and we use ActiveMQ. For this upcoming release, there's a slide here just showing the full set of supported architecture by the platform. I've highlighted the ones that are typically used by most Docs customers here. On the application server side here, we do have a client API that works, a native API that works on various application servers written in both Java and .NET. I think a lot of Docs customers will use the .NET version of this, and they'll typically be running that dynamic delivery module, which sits in front of that application server. But you can see the other versions of products that we have here. Just a couple to pull out from this diagram. Elasticsearch 7.10, that, for those that are familiar with Elasticsearch, that was the last Apache 2 licensed version of Elasticsearch. Since then, Elasticsearch forked their own repository and brought in their own Elastic license. So at the moment, we're still running with that version. And in the next release, we will look to do a sort of cumulative update to bring that up to date to some other version of Elasticsearch. And that's as yet to be decided. Other one to just pull out here is the rename of the .Token JDK. So I suspect that's been mentioned as part of the Docs CM side requirements. So we are now using the Eclipse version of that, the .JDK, as our supported one. And you can continue to use Oracle's own JDK as well. We're still running against Oracle JDK 11. We're not supporting JDK 17 yet, because that has all kinds of knock-on implications of all the Java dependencies that we use within the DXD platform. So in terms of what composes DXD, this diagram just shows the key kind of components typical for a Docs customer. So for Sites customers, there are other components that aren't used, that aren't shown on this diagram. Just briefly running through them. You all know about taxonomy space. You've heard about that a lot over the last 2 days, I suspect. That is a hosted service that both the content manager and our own DXD platform need to talk to. So you need to have a network connection to that service that we host. And then within the platform itself, which can either be cloud hosted or run on premise, are these two sort of tranche of services. There's those that we regard as sort of management services, which are sort of internal facing. And the main one there is the deployer service, and that's our primary content ingestion service, responsible for taking content from our content management systems and putting that content in a format into our various data stores. You can see the stores in the middle of this diagram. So we have what we call the broker, which is our primary content data store. That's sitting in an RDBMS. And that's the one that we use to store the bulk of the content that we have from our systems. Alongside that, we have this Elasticsearch cluster that's providing an indexed view of that data. And that also contains the concept index that we talked about yesterday that supports our semantic AI offering. We do use ActiveMQ within our platform. We use that as a queue, our supported JMS queue, in order that caching and cache invalidation is managed. So when we publish content to the deployer, we obviously send invalidation messages to this queue, and our content service, which is our primary content retrieval service, uses those messages to invalidate entries within its own object cache. So that's the purpose of this queue sitting in the middle. This state store is used by the deployer. So when we publish to the deployer, we essentially take the package coming from Docs in this case, put it in a local binary data store, and then we also maintain state about the state of that package through the deployer lifecycle. So if you think of the deployer as a sort of glorified workflow engine, it runs through a number of steps, and each step operates on that package, extracts some data and puts it somewhere, processes it in some format. So for instance, there'll be a step within that deployer that will populate the broker database. There's a step in there that populates the Elasticsearch search index. There's another step that does the concept sync, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But each of those steps is a point within that life cycle, within that workflow, and we keep a record of that state within the state store, which means that clients to the deployer can obviously query it to find out the state of their package processing. So if you have a large publication in Docs, it may take a while to process all the content, but you need to be kept informed of the state of that deployment. So that's the purpose of this state store. And that also sits within RDBMS, regular sort of database tables. The index service here, this is a supporting service for Elasticsearch. So it has a lot of the sort of logic to manage our data model that sits on top of Elastic. So we have our own abstraction that sits on Elastic in order that if ever we chose to get rid of Elasticsearch, we could switch out the implementation underneath and continue to talk to the index service without any changes. So that's the reason we have this separate service, and it also allows us to scale a deployer independently from the index service, which might have different loads upon it. So that's the input side. You see the extensions mentioned here. So each deployer has a number of extensions loaded into it, and we pre-package Docs with the Docs extension. So Tridion Docs, the layout when you get those artifacts always has the kind of the primary content ingestion piece. If you want to add the taxonomy extension, you need to add that, and we'll talk about that in the upcoming slides. But that's the point of this extension. So you can actually add other ones to the deployer. So if you have sites as well, you can add a sites deployer in, and then that deployer becomes more functional as a result. So on the content retrieval side, I've already mentioned the content service. This is our primary content retrieval service. This is GraphQL based. It also has a slightly earlier REST-based API based on OData, and that talks to the CIL libraries, which are our content interaction libraries. So the current dynamic documentation module that Docs uses, that still uses part of the CIL to interact with the content service. The bulk of it is using the new GraphQL client now, but there's still some pieces in here using these components. And one of those pieces is talking to this discovery service here. And our discovery service is the service that has two purposes, really. One is to provide a token service endpoint to secure our services. So any clients talking to our services need to have that token. So your web app will talk to the discovery service to get a token. Similarly, on the Tridion Docs Content Manager, it needs a similar token. So that's one of the reasons we still have this CIL here, because that's implemented using OData on this discovery service. Going down the tree, we still have this query service. So when we originally built out the Elasticsearch search capability to support Tridion Docs, we had the index and query service as independent services, and this was another CIL-based service. This was actually pure Swagger-based REST API. It wasn't OData-based, but this still exists in here. The current desire is to move much of this query stuff into the content service, and you will have seen that in some of the samples you've seen coming out of this. So our new focus is really enriching the content service to be complete, sort of as a query service for both core data and search data, rather than having this standalone query service. So that should help in the future cut down. But right now, if you still need this piece, you still need this query service. But we will be removing that in future. And the final two on here are a couple of services that maybe get used by some Docs customers. These are typically more used by sites customers. The context service is used to provide device data about mobile applications, iPads, those kind of things, those sort of devices. So it looks at your user agent string and then gives you various properties about that. And we maintain a physical database of about 12,000 devices within this. So you can use that when you're developing a web application to enrich your concept, and perhaps it help provide a more responsive design there. And then finally on this list is our CID service, which provides real-time image translation or image manipulation of HTTP sources, essentially. So it's quite a simple service. You pass it a URL of an image and a number of rules, and then the service will generate a scaled or transformed image based upon those rules, cache it, and then send it back to your web application. And then other requests that come along with the same rules and image, you will obviously get that same image back from the cache. So that means you can sort of single source your images. So if you have a lot of large images that you want to include in your web application, you don't need to pre-render lots of different versions of it. So that's a service that some customers may choose to use, and they're often used together with the context service. So you can use the sort of the sizing from the context service from your device to determine what rule to send into your context interaction device data service here. So that's our sort of platform we have here. DXA-22 is the web application framework that we use to sort of host some of these parts. Dynamic documentation module sits within DXA as a platform, but it is a separate module within there. It's not using a large amount from that. So DXA was originally a sort of a bigger framework for building Tridion sites-based web applications, but it was a useful point to actually build applications against this. The bulk of the out-of-the-box web application is actually a React web application that talks to this. So it's just an interim layer. This is with this quite rich React web application sitting in front. So that's our DXD components. So now I just want to talk briefly. Well, I'll just have a quick check to see if there's any specific questions that I've missed. Okay, if you do have any questions, do drop them into the chat and I'll come and pick them up afterwards. So I just want to talk briefly through the DXD specific parts of semantic AI. So I know Ivo's covered a lot of this already, so I won't reiterate much of the kind of the components here. Suffice to say, I'll be focusing mainly on what's happening in this chunk over here. So first thing you need to be aware of is we're using a shared connector to interact with our taxonomy space service. So this connector is actually written in .NET Core. We use our own connector framework, which is part of our standard DXD platform that can be used for other connectors. So because we have this shared connector, we can implement it and it gets spawned up within the deployer. So it's a .NET process sitting within this Java deployer service. But in order to deploy it, there's two ways around to it. If you're using the add-on service, and the add-on service is a service that's often used by either sites customers or DX customers, i.e. customers that got both sites and docs, that allows you to manage your add-ons. If you're not using the add-on service, then you can still deploy these pieces in your standard artifacts. And the way to do that is to take your layout. So within your layout, you will see these roles deploy add-ons folder. And then you would take the deploy extension, which is this taxonomy one here. You would drop that into a folder called extension. And essentially that folder is the one that our deploy will automatically unzip things and turn them into essentially add-ons at runtime. So that deploys the taxonomy extension. Then the connector, because this is part of the connector framework. So our deployer already has the connector framework sitting within it, but you need to add a connector to that framework. And because this is a shared connector, you need to deploy it in here. So we drop it into this connect tools folder. And then within that connector.json, you need to then configure the connection to taxonomy space. And I think Ivo covered that yesterday as well. But just to reiterate, this is how that configuration may look. So essentially you have some details about the location of your taxonomy space, some credentials, you have a project ID. So any properties that you put in this top section can be overridden in this bottom one, but otherwise these individual namespaces which map onto the specific facets that you have mapped, it will just use the values from above. So each of these things is just like a specialization of this generic config here. So this sample here, obviously, we're saying we're configuring this one facet here. You need to give it the concept scheme URI, which you can dig out of taxonomy space. And then these other features are what the connector uses in order to know that this connector is specifically used for taxonomy and not for some other connector purpose. This fine line here is used to enable different sort of DTAP environments for DXD. So imagine if you had a staging and a production environment, you may not want to deploy the connector on both of them. You may just want it on one or the other, and in which case your single connector config can have entries for both DTAP environments, and you can tune how you deploy each of those connectors. So again, for Docs customers, typically it's probably not as relevant, because if you're not using the add-on service, then you'll be deploying this connector on each of your instances independently. But if you are using the add-on service, then obviously you have a single config point, and in which case this thing becomes more valuable. And as I think, if you look back to Ivo's presentation, it shows you how these things map onto the XML extension settings within the Docs CMPs. This last line is quite important, and I'll come on to this in a minute. So we have a new entitlements feature within DXD 11.6, and that means that you do need to have a license to use taxonomy space. And without that, then this whole piece won't actually run. You'll get an error saying in your log saying that your advanced search feature isn't licensed for use, or something like that. So it's important that you have spoken to your account manager and you've paid for a license for this feature, of course. So there's some additional config that you can do within the deployer. So at the box, you know, the standard properties are usually good enough for most use cases, but there's always a case where you have some issues with connectivity or something like that you may want to tune some of these features. So for the connector itself, in each of our services, we have an application properties. This is a standard Spring Boot method of injecting properties into services. And for the deployer one, which is the one that uses the connector, we have these few connector manager tuning settings that you can use to change things like request timeout, ping timeouts, retry attempts, those kind of things. So it's useful if you ever get problems with your customers, just to check to see if any of these things have been changed from the default, and then you can change them and tune them for your needs. But the defaults are often good enough for most cases. This first one here about the connector profile, this is one of the ways that we use to enable various entire kind of swathes of profiles within our services. So clearly, if you want to use taxonomy, you need to have the connector manager enabled in the deployer. So this one needs to be enabled. It's enabled by default out of the box. But again, if you have a customer who's upgrading, you may find this profile won't exist. So they will, when they're trying to sort of upgrade from the old deployer to the new, they want to make sure when they're merging their config changes that this is in there and the default is active properly. So coming back to the semantic AI piece itself, so we are maintaining this decoupled copy of taxonomy space. That's mainly for performance reasons, but it also does give future options for, if you wanted to attach it to some other taxonomy system at some future stage, maybe that would provide us a similar option. So it is our own implementation of a SCOS enabled hierarchy within Elastic. We have the full set of localized labels and relationships within each of those concepts. So it's a full kind of snapshot on top of what we have. In terms of how the updates work, I think that's been covered before, but just to reiterate, when you first publish a publication or topic that has a reference to one of these tags, one of these concepts, and if it isn't already in our cached version of that taxonomy, we do trigger that resync process in order to ensure that it's been updated. And clearly, if there are changes that don't require re-indexing, then we don't do that. So we look basically to see if there's been any structural changes within the taxonomy. So essentially, when we trigger that refresh, we look to taxonomy space to see if there's any changes between the hierarchical relationships or relations. And if there aren't any, then we don't need to trigger the update on the search index itself. And we talked briefly again yesterday about how the whole blue-green reindex works in order that we can maintain access to the search index whilst we're actually doing the reindex in order to pick up the concept filters that exist within Elasticsearch. So in terms of the reindex piece, I think Ivo showed you in detail how that special publication in Docs needs to look in order to trigger that full resynchronization. So you may choose to do that if, for instance, you have done a sort of significant change to the hierarchies, but maybe you don't want to start republishing a publication in order to trigger that change. So you can just send this special publication, which just triggers that one operation on there. You do need the space within the Elastic cluster in order for that blue-green to work. So if you've got your 500 gigabyte Elastic index, you need a gigabyte, a terabyte of space to do the reindex. Interestingly, Elastic does optimize the index when it does a reindex. So we've seen in our testing that a reindex after having published a lot of data actually reduces the size of the new index by about 20%. And then finally, we do provide this administrative tool, which comes part of one of the roles in the roles on the layout that gives you the ability to manually reindex this. So the case where you may want to do this is perhaps if you have a regularly changing taxonomy, or you have a large number of concepts perhaps, or a large data set that may take a long time to reindex, and you don't want to do it during work hours, then you can, of course, set up a scheduled task or something similar that can just run this reindex out of hours, and then it will keep that up to date in the background. And of course, if there's no changes there, then it's not going to do anything. It's not going to add any burden. It won't reindex the search index. It will just be checking for any changes. So having got this data into our Elastic index, I think you've seen some of the indexes that the search crews we've been exposing. So we've seen some of them yesterday's in the demos about how we can get to that data. And I think Ivo has also shown some queries as well, which we can share if you're interested in to see how you can interact with that. The nice thing, of course, with GraphQL is that it is a service that you can introspect. You can build full clients directly from it. So you can generate a .NET client that talks direct to it if you wish, and then you don't even have to really know GraphQL. You just end up with a sort of a high-level data model against it that you can then use to interact with. One interesting point we have done in this release is, if you recall earlier, I was talking about the CIL was still a requirement for the dynamic delivery module. We have in this release introduced one of the sort of the gaps that we had between the GraphQL and CIL, and that's the sitemap and sub-sitemap trees. So that's now been added to our GraphQL API. And then going forward, we will continue to enhance the GraphQL API to add further sort of semantic capabilities and continue filling in the gaps that there were between the CIL, which are deprecated, and GraphQL. But all those existing APIs still there, they're still supported. So customers can upgrade without having to do any work. And that's true also within the GraphQL API, where we introduced the new search query. So the existing search query that was there is still available for anyone that was using it, and they can just switch over to the new faceted search quite easily if they wish to use that. And then a couple of just little tooling areas that I thought would be worth mentioning. So when you're developing against GraphQL endpoints, you've probably seen the graphical, so GraphQL IQL, which is a commonly used tool that you can actually embed in services, and you can actually download it as well. There's a tool called GraphQL Playground that uses it. But one of the best ones I've found recently is this one called Insomnia. You can get a free access to the client. There's sort of various versions of Insomnia that you can pay for, but the free one's fine for developer use. And the nice thing about this is that it allows you to integrate the whole token flow within your GraphQL requests. So obviously our services are protected by that token service that we talked about. So every time you do a request, you do need to have a valid token, and obviously the token will expire typically after about 5 minutes. So if you're developing against it, it's quite annoying having to keep getting a new token in order to do that. So the nice thing with Insomnia is you can set up a request to get that token, and then you can inject that token in the bearer headers tab on this little screen you see here. And then every time you do your development against GraphQL, it will just work really nicely. You can also set up variables. You can set up environments, different environments. So if you have a staging environment and a live environment, for instance, you can just change the URLs for that without having to create lots of separate calls to it. So it's a little bit like how Postman would work for those familiar with Postman and how it works with REST and others, but Insomnia works really nicely with GraphQL. And it offers all the full schema introspection as well. So if you click on the Docs tab here, you will see all the documentation from that API exposed directly. So if you're building a new web app based upon this from scratch, then this is the one I would suggest you use. And then it comes down to troubleshooting. So there's various tools that people will use to check to see whether things are published or not. I think typical RDBMS tools are well understood. You can use Oracle's own tooling or SQL Server Management Studio to look into our broker database. But when it comes to Elastic, there's various options. So you can use Elastic's own Kibana, which is a service that allows you to build out queries. But one of the ones that's quite nice for developers, again, is using this web-based extension called Elastic View. It's very simple to set up. You just configure an environment at the top. You can send credentials to it if you need to. So obviously you need to know your Elasticsearch endpoint and have access to it. But if you're a developer, then that's probably the case that you may be in an environment where you do have access to that. And then you can delve into the indexes themselves. And sometimes it's a nice quick way of just seeing, is the data that you've published getting into that index correctly? And it just cuts out a sort of a debugging cycle, because sometimes if you're going through GraphQL, you may not know whether it's getting the data correctly from Elastic or whether it's coming from a cache or some such. So again, you can delve into each of these documents. You can see all the data in there in quite a sensible JSON format. And finally, I have set a link here. I'll paste it into the chat in a minute. Hang on. That's giant. So this is a page I set up for the bootcamp. We were doing some sample queries yesterday in the sites spin-off session, but you're welcome to click on this. I'll keep this page up. It has sample queries in there that interact with GraphQL, and within that there's also links to the current environments that are up. So I'm not sure how long they will survive, but you're welcome to try them out on real data sets, assuming you have access to our VPN or have a RWS ID. And if not, the queries there are still useful just to see how some of these queries work. And I'm sure Ivo will share what he's been learning as well when he's been interacting with this. So I mentioned earlier briefly around entitlements. So this is a new feature for DXD and Tridion sites. In fact, there were always used to be entitlements within this platform. It dropped out for a couple of releases for various technology reasons, but it is back in the platform now. So I know it's not something that Docs customers are wishing for, and I saw Dave's comment earlier, but it is something that we do have in our platform. So it does provide some value as well for customers. So typically, we don't often know what customers are running out in the field, so they may well be licensed for extra add-ons or capabilities, but they may not be using them all. So this does give us a bit of an insight to see what's going on customers using our products. But as a result, this entitlement does require a connection to our cloud-hosted entitlement service. And of course, you need a valid license to run this. So these licenses are based on CPU and, well, CPU counts for DXD basically. So you're licensed for a certain number of CPUs. Each service, when you run them, you can configure to consume a certain CPU count from your JVM. So we use the JVM's own available processors property for the Java to determine the CPU's licenses consumed, because if you see how Java actually uses that property is also used to constrain the way that the JVM runs within your environment. So that's the kind of the cleanest we could use to have a sort of cloud and on-premise way of constraining these things. So if you're setting up your services, you can constrain this yourself if you wish on the service to limit the number of CPU usages in order to fit your license, but obviously that has an implication on the performance. Just saw a question from Kurt. So yes, CloudOps will handle that. So there's still a need to have the license key itself, but I suspect if it's being handled through the cloud, your account manager will handle that through CloudOps and their own fulfillment. So the way the license work is when it starts up the services, after an initial 35-minute grace period, it will start doing its first check. The reason for that is that gives you a bit of a grace period if you're doing some development work. We do have the option of developer licenses. Also, if you're only doing short periods of development stuff, 35 minutes is probably sufficient for those kind of pieces. And then beyond that, it does a check every 10 minutes to that license service. Those checks are relatively robust. So if there's network traffic on there, or if there's any throttling of license requests to that service, then the system will just retry again after a number of sort of random seconds. And then it eventually you should get a success. If eventually you get an error communicating with that license server, you will obviously log errors around that. And if we get an invalid license or an expired license, then we will we will stop the service, and we will also log an error within the service, much like this example I showed here. Now, in terms of installing it, so you said most customers are indeed on the cloud, but if you're doing it on premise, the customer does need their customer ID, so they can either contact customer support. So in the same way of getting hold of your artifacts in the first place, you know, if you need DXD 11.6, you need to ask them for that, or their account manager, and then they will initiate that fulfillment process. So there's a sort of back office process that we have that will generate the key within our entitlement system, and then they will get a customer ID, which will look like one of these UIDs that you can see in this example on the right here. And then once you have that ID, the easiest thing is to put it as an environment variable on your services that run against it. Alternatively, you can add it to that application properties. So that application properties sits within all of our services. So you would have to add it to, you know, potentially 4 services, I suspect. So at least the index, discovery, content, and deployer. Or you can pass it in as a command line argument to the install scripts. So there's various ways of injecting it in, but I say the environment variable one's the easiest one because that then gets picked up throughout any service that's looking for it. And then the final slide I had was around some changes we've done recently to our deployer. So again, for existing customers that are in the cloud, this has no effect on how you work because this is all handled for you. But for on-premise customers, we used to provide 2 kinds of roles for the deployer. One was what we called the deployer combined role, and then we had this separate roles where we had a deployer API endpoint and a deployer worker. So in the past, we would have a single deployer endpoint and then multiple worker roles. So it worked quite well, but it did mean that you had extra complexity in determining which of the various combinations of deployer you choose. And we've found in our own cloud deployments that the combined deployer can be scaled pretty well single-handedly, you know, horizontally, and if you need to scale it vertically, and if you need to scale it horizontally, you can actually just scale the deploy combined role itself without having to jump across to this split role things. So we've got rid of those 2 split roles now. We just have a single deploy role that can serve either purpose. And if you do want to scale it horizontally, then you do need to add your own load balancer in front of it, much like you would do in front of our own content service. So it just simplifies the deployment options a little bit and reduces some of the configuration points. And then each of those services will talk to those various data stores that I covered earlier in the session.